very much. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm very pleased to see the audience here, and I hope I can tell you something that is new, or that at least can be remembered as relevant after this talk. Now, the question for this workshop was: is it inevitable that Britain will leave the EU? And I can make it very easy and say no, because in politics there are events that can change dynamics. Political actors may surprise others. It's a competitive game, so truly inevitable are very, very few things. However, it is quite instructive to go back 2 years ago and think about the situation in the UK then, and analyze the changes that have occurred over the last 2 years. And then we can see that the possibility of leaving the EU 2 years ago seemed rather fanciful and outlandish and was at the fringes of debate, whereas now the possibility, I would argue, is no longer negligent. Indeed, there is plausibility to Britain having to eventually leave the EU, and the probabilities, I would argue, are rising because of what I will analyze as a spiral effect involving 3 main components. So this is my central argument, that we are in the midst of kind of a dynamic setting which is making the outcome of Britain leaving the EU increasingly more likely, but of course by no means inevitable. And I would argue there are still, for those who think this is a very undesirable outcome, there are still possibilities for preventing it. So I would suggest that you all try and remember the situation in 2010 with the coalition, Libcon coalition formed. And those of us who've been watching European integration will remember probably what the analysis was at the time. And I think many thought, okay, so we have one party in power, half of which may want to leave the EU, but there were also a lot of signs that there wasn't going to be a lot of movement necessarily towards the state where we are at the moment. If you look at the coalition agreement, for instance, it says under the heading of Europe, the government believes that Britain should play a leading role in an enlarged European Union, but that no further powers should be transferred to Brussels without a referendum. We will ensure that the British government is a positive participant in the European Union, playing a strong and positive role with our partners, with the goal of ensuring that all nations of Europe are equipped to face the challenges of the 21st century. And then there were some further paragraphs about about defending national interest in the budget and justice and home affairs, but really the tone was really one of, I suppose, preserving the status quo, positive engagement. Yes, there would be no major, no big transfer of power, but with the Lib Dems and the coalition, there was a feeling that really the next 4 years would continue until the next general election, which may bring about either a new coalition, or if there was a conservative majority, then of course there would be a big change. But really there was an assumption that there wasn't going to be a big change. Certainly Cameron and Haig were seen as certainly Euro-pragmatists. Haig seemed to be very, very interested in the opportunity that Europe offered for foreign policy and for enhancing Europe's role in the world. So he seemed to have ditched quite a bit of the Eurosceptic rhetoric he had adopted in his early years as a conservative leader. Europe was a bit of a non-issue in the media, didn't really play a big role, and public opinion was broadly in favor of EU membership. So that was becoming more skeptical, but really broadly in favor, and there wasn't broadly in favor, if a bit confused generally about Europe, but we'll come to that. Now let's zoom forward to 1st of November this year, in the aftermath of the threatened veto on the budget. Nick Clegg's Chatham House speech, where he tried to raise alarm bells about using the veto about reclaiming sovereignty, and he said, well, you create disappointed expectations. Before you know it, you've got a full-blown crisis. Then people say, well, what's the point? We failed in this. We should get out altogether. That's my worry, that actually you're on a trajectory to something much more serious and more threatening to the long-term national interests of this country than the rather sort of seductive idea, oh, well, can't we just rewrite the rules of membership would apply? And he talks about create a cycle of disappointment and greater cynicism and leading towards a major political crisis. Now, of course, Nick Clegg doesn't have a good press, and of course a lot of people pointed out that maybe he has contributed to the situation his party finds itself in. He's allowed the sovereignty bill to go forward with a kind of extended wording of what transfer of powers means. It's kind of quite broad wording if you look at it. And he has, of course, agreed to the quite significant decision on wielding a veto on the bringing the fiscal compact into the EU treaties about a year ago now. So maybe he's not without fault in bringing about the current state of affairs. However, so that's one criticism. The other one is, of course, well, maybe he's just fear-mongering. Maybe he's just alarmist, you know, to activate some of the kind of pro-European voices and so forth. But I would say he's not alarmist, and I think in many ways it's actually worse if you kind of try to understand the dynamics at play. And I think for analyzing the dynamics, it may be useful to draw on some theorizing about kind of feedback loops in politics and between different actors and the notion of the spiral effect. What is so fascinating about the spiral effect is that it transforms a situation in which one particular outcome seemed to be very implausible and irrational for most of the actors concerned towards a situation where exactly that outcome would appear very kind of plausible and would appear as rational for some of the actors concerned, and where you could where small events can have big consequences. So the spiral can destabilize assumptions about the assumptions that the actors hold and kind of trap them in a situation where where new pressures are bearing on them that they cannot control anymore. So it's a dynamic system, but the system in kind of the spiral, if you think about the bathtub, it becomes ever closer and ever more powerful the more you kind of go down that spiral. One of the other things when you talk about spiral in conflict between countries, interstate conflict, one of the interesting things is that initially when partners, for instance, interpret each other's actions, for instance, in the European setting, very often there's an understanding for the domestic pressures that may bear upon particular political leaders. However, the more you are in a kind of spiral of confrontation, the more you get what is called an attribution error, i.e. When you yourself know that your actions are often caused by particular situations, you find yourself in time pressure from particular actors, cleavages within your party, you attribute the actions of others to some long-term plan and some underlying big drive and motivation and strategy. So what might initially appear as unintended consequences or coincidences, small causes, is seen as a coordinated plan and kind of conspiracy. So there is a danger, if you are in that spiral between different partners, that you would see particular moves as malicious, as intentionally designed to thwart your objectives. So yeah, we'll come to how this then applies here in this setting. So I think this is a useful, the spiral is a useful notion or a useful concept for analyzing what has been going on the last 2 years and where I think, on what kind of trajectory we are finding ourselves in. And I would argue that there are three interlocking forces that make up that spiral, that drive the dynamics of the spiral. The first is the kind of domestic dimension, the domestic spiral. The second one is the UK-EU dimension, UK versus its European partners. And the third one are the forces and the implications deriving from the euro crisis and the pressures arising from the euro crisis. So I'd like to look at each of these three dimensions in turn. So the domestic spiral is made up of course, a number of complex actors. So you've got government, parliaments, news media, and public opinion. So when you look at the dynamics within government, it is quite clear that we've entered a phase in which the relatively small number of Eurosceptics in the British Parliament have disproportionate power over what is going on in all discussions about Europe, because they've been willing they're willing to jeopardize the stability of the government over this particular issue. So what initially started with Cameron giving a little bit of meat to the Eurosceptics by withdrawing from the EPP party even before the start of government, he has found himself in a dynamic where he had to kind of give ever more to kind of appease the Eurosceptic part of the party, and that had unintentional, which had the consequences of rather emboldening them, because they were seeing that they were making progress towards what, for many of them, is the ultimate aim, namely the UK leaving the USSR, or whatever language is used in these circles. So the more Cameron tried to position himself as, well, really, I'm also a Eurosceptic. I'm sharing your concerns. I'm sharing your analysis of what is wrong about Europe, but really, I just have a different idea of what to do about it. I mean, the more he positioned himself in that kind of, the more he framed himself in that kind of Eurosceptic argument, the more he was entrapped by it, and the less he was able to put forward any positive case about how important it might be for the UK to be a positive partner in Europe, as the coalition agreement initially stated. So, so he agreed to the referendum lock, which again he was seen as kind of giving something to the Eurosceptic and was hoping to close down the debate, but the opposite has happened. He was basically pushed into a veto, announcing basically a veto on the fiscal compact, which he didn't want to do, and which went down very, very badly with European partners if you pre-announce that you're casting a veto before you actually go to the summit, and that made it that led to the landmark defeat, where the UK was for the first time in a minority of one, eventually joined by the Czech Republic, but really it was in a minority of one, vetoing, bringing the fiscal compact into the treaty. So he's been pushed along that road, and kind of unable to extract himself from kind of offering ever more. Part of that dynamic is that, of course, is the underlying the rise of UKIP and the threat that UKIP poses to any conservative majority. So it's not just the MPs in his own party; it's also what UKIP might do if somehow that issue wasn't somehow occupied by Cameron, the Conservative Party. Secondly, even though the Lib Dems are generally pro-Europe, they were increasingly becoming tired of being scapegoated for a whole host of things. So they were becoming very vulnerable to media criticism, so they were increasingly less willing to stick up their neck for European issues. And then you've got Labour, which was all, as we've seen on the budget, was all too happy to, in a sense, join the Eurosceptics to help the government look weak. But really, voting on an issue where, in terms of overall position that they want the UK to play in Europe, that wasn't probably a very kind of statemently thing to do. But having said that, even within Labour, there has been a kind of degree of power transition from the Blairites, which were very pro-European, towards the Brownites, with Ed Miliband probably being quite pro-European still, but Ed Balls being pretty Eurosceptic, if you think about it. So he's been so Labour again is not playing that kind of counterweight either. When you think about public opinion, there has been also quite a bit of change. In the recent YouGov poll, there was a plurality of British citizens. Of 49 say they would rather vote to leave the Union, only 28 would say they would vote to stay, and of course a lot say they don't know. I think what is, these polls, one has to be cautious with these polls, of course. But what is significant is that in the UK there was always a very high proportion of people who don't know, who were really confused. High level of misinformation through the media, and really a lot of people who really didn't know. And I think that is still underlying that, but there has been a shift in public opinion towards being substantially more skeptical. And that actually marks out the UK from other countries. So in Germany, the same question, you would have still a majority of 57 of Germans voting for staying in the EU. You also have the polls about trust in the EU, where you have Britain, Eurobarometer saying only 16% would tend to trust the EU, 60% of Britons, which is lower than Greece, with 19%. And it's the lowest of all European countries by a big margin. So the European average on trust in the EU is 31%. So Britain is at 16. And it was higher, was substantially higher in 2 years. I don't have the exact figure. So clearly, public opinion has shifted over the last years. And of course, we know from the Leveson inquiry that there are a number of papers in the UK. If you're a journalist working for them, you can't write a single constructive story because it won't pass the editorial offices. They have a very strong partisan line. They will only allow certain stories to be published, nothing else. So there's kind of there's newspaper campaigning, long-standing drip against Europe, but now they smell blood, because there has been some kind of progress. And business has been a bit silent on issues, and the city is concerned about regulation, so they're also silent, even though if Britain was to leave the EU, they might be the first to leave as well, because they want to trade with Europe rather than want that as a base for trading with this biggest single market of the world, rather than being marooned on the island. So anyway, City, biggest fund of the Conservative Party, hasn't used that leverage yet, even though they have a very clear position. So that's so we have the domestic spiral, which basically means that there is a relatively kind of everyone is watching everyone else on the pro-European camp to make the case, and nobody really wants to stick their neck out. Whereas the Eurosceptics are kind of pushing the boundary ever further. So you have cabinet ministers like Michael Gove saying, well, really, it's not a bad thing if Britain left the EU. Well, which is remarkable for a cabinet minister to say if you look at the coalition agreements, if you look at long-stated British policy that it is in UK's national interest to be in the EU. So they're kind of they're gradually pushing out the boundary of what is now acceptable to say in British discourse. So that's one dynamic that goes in a certain direction. Feeding into that is the dynamic between Britain and its partners, which is characterized by loss, quite a dramatic loss of political capital that Britain has with its partners. It started again with the withdrawal from the EPP in the European Parliament, which means that the Conservative Party has kind of removed itself from its conservative sister parties, and that means also that it's kind of less in tune. It doesn't quite know as much about where the political mood is. It can't form coalition as well as it used to. So that was just the start. But what really happened then was, this landmark case of the fiscal compact was, I think, quite dramatic. That what has changed is that whereas in the past most European partners were very keen to go the extra mile to meet some of the British requests, even though they are still certainly the leaders are still saying, yes, we want Britain to stay, Britain is a valued partner, they're not going to give Britain something for that. If Britain is being perceived as behaving unreasonably, it's kind of making demands that nobody else makes. If Britain is portraying Europe as something which only works if we get something out of it, regardless of what the others are, if there's no sense of being able to compromise, then of course a lot of people say, well, you're undermining some of the kind of basic tenets, the informal rules on which we are working together. So what has happened is that Britain has lost a lot of political capital with those countries which are traditionally its allies. Whether it's allies in terms of economic liberalization, whether it's allies in terms of enlargement, there are hardly any countries anymore, leaving apart the Czech Republic, which would stick their neck out for Britain and would kind of join an alliance. Rather, there's a feeling of kind of being tainted by association with Britain if you're kind of being seen as working with a partner which is acting unreasonably. And I think that feeling of acting unreasonably has first occurred with the fiscal compact, where Britain, of course, vetoed something that they were in principle in favor of, that they couldn't then prevent happening, and where there were costs for the other partners. It was basically about bringing this into the EU treaties, and it was all a bit of a constructed argument that this would remove some sort of powers from Britain. So I think that was clearly seen as being acting unreasonable. Again, with the veto, I think a lot of partners are sympathetic to the argument for cutting the EU budget, but again, what you don't do is you don't say, well, I will cast the veto if X happened, because if you see that nobody else is willing to go that far, what's the point of meeting in the first place? Yeah. So there's nothing wrong with defending your national interest, but there are certain ways in which you engage with your other European partners that is appropriate, and there are other ways that are considered inappropriate. So every government is influenced by its domestic constituency, but it seems that Britain thinks that its own domestic constituencies is somehow should dictate what is happening in Brussels, and as unreasonable. So, as I said, lots of political capital, and member states are willing to work around Britain. It is in some ways it's remarkable that at the moment no one has yet called for Britain to leave. I saw a recent visit of Angela Merkel to the European Parliament, and Nigel Farage was saying, look, it's a useless case. You are going in the integrationist way. You're creating all sorts of problems, and Britain can't follow you. Why don't talking to Ms. Merkel? Why don't you ask Cameron that really it would be better for us to leave? And of course, Merkel, being Merkel, she wouldn't take the bait, and she said, well, really, we want to work with Britain and our partners. But just imagine if one or two European statesmen, not just little parliamentarians, but some senior people were starting to say, look, Britain, you're more trouble than you're worth. What impact that would have on British domestic opinion, British debate? We are not wanted anymore. That's powerful stuff. And thirdly, of course, you have, in a sense, the beginning of the whole crisis, and one of the reasons why the initial situation 2 years ago was changing, and that's the euro crisis and the repercussions from it. And if you're a good old neo-functionalist, you would see that what the euro crisis has done, it has unleashed functional spillover. So you've done an integrative step, and that has created massive problems that can only be solved by either solving it or by going further. The status quo is untenable. So that is widely realized. There are debates about how far you need to go in the direction of centralization, but it's clear that now most European governments, or the Eurozone governments, have sided with the German position that yes, you need to go further. Certainly you need to go further in the direction of control, but that also means eventually you also need to go further in the direction of helping to create competitive, close the competitiveness gap within Europe, redistribute some money, fiscal guarantees, banking union, euro bonds, all of that will happen in some way or another eventually. And to legitimize that, you will have to bring in some new direct democratic elements. So what we're seeing is building blocks of a quite more centralized Europe with more controversy, more redistribution, more centralization of some elements to make the Eurozone. It doesn't imply total supranationalization, it doesn't imply a central government, but there are strong, in a sense, functionalist pressures from the markets, from economic logics that require governments to go further than they would normally, under normal circumstances, be prepared to do. And that, of course, poses problems. Britain has said, well, the British government has said that they're in favor. Some Eurosceptics say it's awful, it's horrible, it's undemocratic, it will not work. So there's got two positions within the British government, but really the inexorable logic is that the core around the Eurozone will either dissolve completely in a huge mess, or it will integrate further and form more, quite stronger institutions, move eventually towards some kind of bicameral system, some sort of elected commission president, whatever you think about the benefits of that, And these steps would leave Britain, well, Britain would not be able to follow that kind of building block for the foreseeable future. So that creates problems about Britain's position on the kind of the outside of the Eurozone, portraying themselves as still being influential. Certainly neglect tries to portray that as still a good position to be in, that there are various projects, certainly the European foreign security policy, where Britain can still play a leading role, where Britain could still lead the outside players. But I think the dominant discourse so far has been, well, there are all these people, all these governments that are seen as influential, they are driving change, and we are not influential. We are outside the debate, we are outside that kind of moving core, and that is difficult to stomach for Britain's view of itself in the world and its view of Europe, that it has to be seen as a leader somewhere. And of course Blair at the time was using foreign policy as still being a leader, was very influential in that area, also in justice and home affairs. So what is the outcome of that spiral? Well, the outcome is that there's growing uncertainty. There might be these dynamics coming from public rhetoric, and there's, I think there's a possibility that a weak government will call a referendum on even before there is a new treaty, because they're somehow bounced into it. And if the environment was very unfavorable, if there was a lot of polarization in the debate, if there were the wrong voices from the continent, if there were a lot of private individuals, Eurosceptics putting in a lot of money, that this referendum could go in favor of leaving the EU. I personally think this would have very, very problematic long-term consequences for Britain. It would be pretty much an irreversible step. It would be economically costly. It would be politically very costly to be at the fringes and having to negotiate with the core. I think the situation would be much more uncomfortable than is currently understood in public debate. So I would say we are in this spiral, but we're still kind of in the outer reaches. And it would be dangerous to underestimate the dynamics that pull that whole nexus down, and it would be necessary to break out of that dynamic to have some sort of a concerted campaign, academics, business, NGO, who would make the case for why Britain's membership of the EU is a good thing, some public recognizable figures, and to really kind of stem that dynamic now, because if you wait too long, you can't turn around public opinion in a couple of weeks leading towards a referendum, given all the history of kind of drip negative coverage of the EU. So that's my view.
And now it's maybe Professor just
talk too long.
Thank you. Thank you very much. What I'll try and do is to avoid overlap with Christoph, because I think we both are broadly in the same position in terms of where we think the UK is at. And speaking as a Brit, it's a kind of curious thing, because now the UK has been a member of the communities for almost 40 years. It means that for somebody like me, I have no conscious pre-accession memory at all. Well, the memories I have of pre-accession is certainly not really connected. And part of me worries whether, as the UK's relationship with the EU sort of enters into middle age, whether there's sort of middle age crisis, and we're kind of looking for something a bit more sporty and sexy, and trading in the EU for something else. But I think that the kind of the notion of exit, which did, I think, or was something that people whispered about in the dark, is now very much into the light. And so exit has to be considered as a plausible future for the UK. It's not inevitable, and I agree that the politics, frankly, matters. But I think the probability has increased quite significantly over the period in which the coalition government has been in office, which is not to say that the coalition government is the cause, and I want to say something about what I think some of the longer term causes are. But perhaps my first observation is, does it matter, in the sense that the EU is already leaving the UK anyway, and so as I think Christoph has said it very clearly, I mean, the UK has a sort of diminished political capital within the European Union, and for the other member states, the issue of UK departure, Brexit, if you prefer, is something which they would not feel constitutes the end of the world as far as the European integration project is concerned, and rather would make things perhaps tidier as you have a group of Eurozone member states which are moving sort of crab-like towards a closer political relationship. One of the things which is clear, I think, with the sort of structure and modalities of the way that the Eurozone group are going, let's call it kind of super EU, for want of a better label, is that what it might look like is indeterminate, but the direction of travel seems to be rather clear, and the UK is not going to be part of that, whether it's in or out. So I think that leads then to interesting questions about kind of what's there in terms of sort of menu of choices for the UK, which is more than just exit. It can be remaining in, but the EU itself has changed. So we've got kind of two dynamics at work here: both the UK dynamic in terms of its relationship with the EU dynamic, and if the UK is outside this kind of super EU, this hardcore EU, this monetary and fiscal union, then what are the alternatives for the UK? What are the plausible alternatives for the UK? Being in that core group is not a plausible alternative. And I think the interesting thing about the shift in the UK debate on Europe is that it was not implausible until certainly the late Blair period, that the UK might still join the single currency. And it was politically possible. It's unlikely, but it was still a political possibility, and that over a very short period of time, as it looks like, kind of the sort of politics and the madman suggests the UK might be in the Eurozone. That's not just because of the Eurozone crisis. So what could the UK do? What would be the alternative? Well, it's not only the Eurozone. It could see itself as the kind of best of the rest, leading a sort of confederacy against the unionist states. But there again, the other members of the confederacy are seeking to join the union rather than organise themselves against the union. So there isn't really much there by way of a sort of enduring political project for the UK. The UK could, and for some within the Conservative Party, should seek a kind of relationship that looks like an EEA type relationship, although the nature of that, or what might be an offer for the UK is contested. The UK has obviously tried that in the past. The EEA exists, endures. It's obviously been diminished across time as you've had accessions of successive states, but you've now got a fairly sort of stable membership, have had a stable membership of the EEA, and of course many of you will be aware of the costs of EEA membership in terms of being a rule taker rather than being a rule maker. But that's something that the UK may decide to suck it and see. There is an alternative. What the UK could seek, if it's outside, or even in this is not mutually exclusive from these other positions, to pursue the kind of policy of promiscuous bilateralism, different kinds of partnerships, different relationships across different policy domains, a kind of a sort of curious and unique arrangement for the UK that's a bit of Norway, a bit of Sweden, and possibly a bit of Turkey. So it could be a kind of supercharged, privileged partnership that the UK could find itself in, which may suit other European states like Turkey, for example, just to introduce an element of controversy. So I think there is we haven't yet had a serious debate about what the alternatives are for the UK, to make a sort of plausible, a plausible choice possible on the part of publics and elites in terms of what we are letting ourselves in for if we do take the decision to exit. But I do think that over the last 10 years, I would say, the UK has taken steps closer to the exit door than we did previously. And these are steps I think it's difficult to take back for reasons I want to clear. And I think there were sort of 5 aspects of this which I think are quite difficult to reverse, if I may. And I'll cover these fairly briefly. The first is which Christoph I think has done very well, the politics of the UK political parties on Europe. You know, the Conservative Party retreat from Europe, now the sort of default Labour position on Europe, which is the flip-flop, and the sort of retreat of the Liberal Democrats winning power from what many thought was a kind of core and unshakable policy. And allied to all of that, of course, is the rise of UKIP, you know, to have a political force within the UK that stands for exit and has a mandate in terms of representatives within European, the UK political scene. And we might stir into that also the kind of the impacts of Scottish independence, or the Scottish independence debate, which has a very complicating effect for UK political party dynamics, not least the potential loss for Labour, the prospect of forming a majority in a sort of rump UK Parliament. But that, you know, that would get us into a whole other set of issues that we can take up in the Roundtable. So, I think the politics of the political parties, it's easily actually to see, difficult to see rather how the parties are going to take themselves back, not least because if you look at what's happening in terms of selection of members of Parliament, the Conservative Party in particular, that the selection process for members, Conservative members of Parliament, means that sort of Eurosceptic majority is entrenched now and will be for quite some time. The second step, or thing I think has got the UK closer to the exit, is the rise of English nationalism. English nationalism. And here I think what's interesting here is that there is this is done superbly in a book by a guy called Bob Wellings, that something called entitled English Nationalism and Euroscepticism. There is a sort of emergence of the idea that Englishness is defined in terms of opposition to Brussels and all things from Brussels. And that's part of a kind of search for alternative visions of Britain via a sort of emergence of Englishness. You know, the English have a kind of uncertainty as to what they are. They feel that they need they actively feel they need a search for a notion of Englishness, but certainly post-devolution and with independence in prospect, there is this kind of sense around, you know, what are the kind of core issues for the English, and is this kind of opposition to Brusselsism, and you know, a shifting debate over the last decade where Brussels, well, certainly from the early 1990s, where Brussels was the enabler, single market and all that, as a facilitator for issues to the British advantage, to Brussels as a constraint. Brussels as an obstacle to all that the UK might seek in terms of the European project. So, first of all, the sort of dynamics of party politics. Second, the rise of this English nationalism in opposition to Brussels. Thirdly, and I won't dwell on this because I think it's already done very well, is the actions of the coalition government itself, which in shorthand, they basically decentered Europe in the UK foreign policy debate, but also, I think, interestingly, intellectualised a new foreign policy that displaces Europe in the centre of the UK's foreign policy. And you know, we've heard about the EU building the Stability and Governance Pact, but there is also a search for a kind of new European bilateralism. If you look at the Franco-British treaties, things like the Nordic-Baltic summit and so on, you know, that this is not just a sort of declaratory policy, there's a searching for new kinds of relationships for the UK, and that's been a core project of the coalition government. Fourthly, there is, I think, something which is only emerged very, very recently, is an intellectualizing of the alternatives for the UK. Not an intellectualizing of the alternatives in terms of models of the relationship the UK might have with the EU, which I mentioned earlier. That's kind of curiously under-rehearsed. But there's an intellectualizing of the alternatives for the UK's place in the world, which is that the UK can have a place in the world by bypassing Brussels. And if you look at the national security strategy, if you look at the security and defence review, if you look at the quartet of speeches that William Hague made when he came to power, talking about a networked UK, the UK is plugged into all sorts of things, and the European Union is just one network. You've got all the other networks going on, the Commonwealth is one, and the UK can think about its neighbourhood, for example, without thinking about the EU. Hence, the turn to Turkey, if you like, this desire for a very, very strong Anglo-Turkish understanding and the energy and effort that's gone into that. And the way in which you can plot this in terms of ministerial visits, speeches and so on, the focus has been on the BRICS and others, an emerging power. If you look at it in terms of the UK's development policy, one of the aspects, perhaps under-remarked aspects of UK, the retaining strength, the enduring strength of the UK development policy through the ODA is to preserve a national development policy as opposed to seeing it subsumed within the European policy and to pursue national prerogatives, but also at the same time kind of recalibrating the transatlantic relationship, talking about it as a kind of essential relationship, but one in which the UK kind of feels as if it is losing touch with the US, so it has to think about that, but reorganise the relationship with the US alongside these other emerging powers. So I think this, as an academic, I think the sort of intellectualising of alternatives is absolutely fascinating. That this is no longer harking back to the past. It's much more about alternative futures, and the EU in that story or set of stories looks much more like the past than the future, and I think that's fascinating. And lastly, the sort of fifth reason why I think we're sort of standing or hanging around the exit is because of what I call the referendum fetish, which is that the issue of a referendum, an in or out referendum, or the issue of a referendum on the European Union, whether it's on increasing the increasing powers of Brussels, i.e. a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty or not, we've now slid into a position in which I'm absolutely certain that for the next generation, all three political parties will be committed to an in-out referendum. I think that's the logic of the statements that have been made by the three political parties. You may think it's a surprise to say that for Labour, but if you look at things that John Cruddas has been saying, he was conducting the sort of Labour policy review, there has been sort of urging within the shadow cabinet that Labour can't allow itself to be outflanked by the Tories on this issue. And the Liberal Democrats, for quite different reasons, have no problem with the idea of an in-out referendum. And so, it's almost like a kind of referendum arms race that we've got into. The positiving of a referendum has now gone on, and to sort of pursue that idea of arms race, and we've got into what you might call what was in terms of nuclear weapons was called a wargasm. You might suddenly have nuclear war without expecting it. I think we've got a kind of referendum-gasm. We're going to get a referendum, and nobody really wants one, certainly in terms of political law, because it could put itself in a position in which it has great difficulty in terms of negotiating its way out of that, and the future is uncertain. But we're sort of stuck there by dealing with a whole series of perhaps unintended consequences, of actions that we've taken. So, I think for me those are the 5 reasons why it's actually very difficult now for the UK to draw itself back from the current position that it's currently in. And we have to be honest that one of the things that's happened across time, and we're talking in terms of decades, is that the EU is an issue that divides. divides parties, divides parliaments, divides publics. It's not an issue that one can think about as a kind of unifying narrative for the UK. But that sits curiously alongside a kind of British enthusiasm for informal integration. You know, the Brits are not different from other EU citizens in terms of their enthusiasm, in terms of consumption, behaviour, and generally picking up the sort of benefits of free movement and the opportunity that exists from this European political and economic space. But one of the reasons why I think it's difficult for the UK to pull back from that, pull back from the situation that it finds itself in, is that it no longer, and I think it was very well put by Christoph, where the UK finds itself, that the UK can no longer be an agenda setter for the reasons that you set out clearly in terms of its relationship with other partners, because frankly it hasn't got anybody else really to dance with in terms of a relationship beyond France and some fairly circumscribed areas of military collaboration. So rather a rather sort of depressing state of affairs, I'm afraid, but one in which I think that the UK is I think locked into, not the question of whether in or out, but this kind of this perennial awkward partners is now become the absolute default position of the UK, whereas you could make the case, certainly under the previous government, that it had strived towards being a much more pragmatic player within the European Union. Not an ideologue on the European issue, but a much more pragmatic player. And it's quite difficult to see the UK political scene where the pragmatism on Europe might actually come from. So one has to probably look, perhaps look beyond the political party and the political scene for sort of the injection of pragmatism into a British debate, which probably means the business community. Well, let's wait and see. Thank you.
Thank you both of our speakers. Before I open for questions, I want to ask if Christoph has any comments on the issues that Richard raised.
Yeah, just maybe two quick comments. One is, of course, that I agree with a lot of what has Richard said, and his analysis of the politics and the rise of English nationalism. I think are very relevant for understanding some of the underlying dynamics here. I suppose on the referendum fetish issue, I think this is something that is, of course, much broader than just the UK. I mean, we have an underlying issue of declining trust in institutions, in authorities, in politicians, in elites. And of course, one of the reasons is that there's a perception among citizens that whoever is elected, they can't change very much. Of course, there are differences according to electoral systems, but on the whole, there's the sense that there's a diminished range of options that is available to any government because of the complexity that has emerged to deal with different constituencies, globalization, of course, also European integration. And therefore, these referendum on in-out are so attractive because it seems to give electorates the power to do something finally, to make an impact, and that's of course in a sense the attractiveness of having these choices suddenly. It is erosive of a certain version of democracy. It is very erosive. It is problematic, but I think there is this wider issue about trust in authorities and how much influence do the electorates still have. The other question, and I suppose that's where I'm a little bit more positive, or a little bit more would maybe have a slightly different take, is on the argument of Europe leaving the UK and the UK having no realistic prospect for being agenda setter. I think it may be instructive to think for a moment, what would a Blair government have done if it was faced with the same situation in the Eurozone crisis? How would they have tried to sell, how would they have tried to craft an approach which is clearly not inside that core? And I wonder whether if they were seen by their partners as somehow negotiating in good faith and saying, yes, we want to be in there, we want to be contributing, whether there wouldn't have been a lot of goodwill to give Britain its area where they could exercise leadership, being seen as influential, and that would have made it easier for the government to say, look, there are still all these areas where we make a big difference, still these areas where, yeah, we're not part of that core and we don't want to go, but still there's a significant role for us that is commensurate to how we see ourselves. So I don't think there is somehow an inevitability to the core becoming more closely integrated and Britain not being able, the room for maneuver becomes smaller, I agree, but I think there could have been still a role there that could have been crafted around leading different policy areas, but clearly that's very difficult for the current government to do after they've trapped themselves in a certain way in which they frame the debate about Europe. So I don't think that, and the dynamics with their partners as well now, to recuperate from that, it's very, very difficult.
Right, so now maybe if anyone would like to start making any comments or any questions,
Sasha, yes, thanks. Thank you both very much for your interesting and insightful talks. I have two questions, I think, that go for both of you. First of all, I'm interested in your views on how all of this relates to Scottish independence. And I think that recent years have seen a rise across the EU in certain very significant separatist movements, also in Belgium and in Spain. And I maybe on a more general level, that links into what you said about how citizens feel that in the increasing complexity of a globalized world, they don't have a real say in things, and therefore they feel that just scaling things down and becoming independent and small will solve that. And so that might also be a relevant factor in this discussion about the UK wanting to leave the EU or not. But on a more specific level, I think that Scottish independence, if that goes through, will have a significant impact on the UK's position, of what is left of the UK then, in its relationship to the EU. Because as far as I understand, Scotland is a very strong pro-EU bloc within the UK. So if they leave, I think that it will become even more difficult for the UK to stay in the EU, or maybe you have another view on that. So that's the first question. And then the second one is perhaps even a little more vague. I noticed in studying the implementation of different member states of EU law that although the UK has always been, well, a Eurosceptic, I don't know, but a very skeptical actor in the process, they always match that with an incredible seriousness and diligence as to the implementation of the EU. So that sort of match of taking things seriously and therefore also bargaining very hard, I think, made it to the other EU countries very acceptable that the UK would portray itself or would position itself like this, because it matched it with actually implementing the things that were agreed. So, and I think that you both mentioned that this spiral that's taking place now is harming the UK's, I think, image of a rational actor within the EU and its partners. And so maybe it's not even about going down the plug hole or not, but the spiral itself, which is in the long term, the real problem, because just for a moment thinking that it won't be that likely in the end that the UK will leave, what they will be left with is a significantly diminished credibility within the EU. And if they do leave on such bad terms, such an ugly divorce, basically, I think their bargaining position to, for example, join the quite privileged position of the EEA with Switzerland and Norway will benefit from that, even though they are rule takers. Might also, the other EU member states might say, well, you don't get to do that because we just don't appreciate the way this has all happened. So that spiral itself is, of course, very damaging, but I think the spiral is also very beneficial to certain actors, which is those in the UK political process. Because, well, the Eurosceptics, obviously, they love this. They might not even want it to go down the plug hole because then they have nothing left to argue against. I mean, they sort of exist by virtue of this EU where they can argue against. So if there's no membership, what are they going to do? And the Tories as well, they benefit from this sort of anti-EU sentiment, but the plug hole scenario is not in their interest, as you said, nor in Labour's. So they all benefit from the short-term spiral, but they don't benefit from it actually going down the plug hole. So this is, I don't know if this is really a question, but it's more a comment that I thought you might find interesting. Okay, thank you.
Would like to respond?
Maybe I could say something about Scotland, because I don't know how many of you follow the work of the Foreign Affairs Committee with the House of Commons, but it's doing an inquiry on the implications for UK foreign policy of Scottish independence, and I gave evidence to the committee about 3 weeks ago, looking at EU policy and what the implications for the UK might be of the EU policy, and of course, because you've got the whole issue in the UK going on at the same time as the relationship with Scotland. But what's obvious, I think, to all you around the table, there's no precedent, which means that actually quite easily model what Scottish independence might look like, whether you think it's plausible or implausible as a future. But it would also be pretty testing, shall we say, to have Scotland, by whatever route it might accede to the EU, and there's some debate about what the route might have to be, that was committed, as it would be under its treaty obligations, to be both a member of Schengen. Think about that for a moment. England out, Scotland in, and also a single currency, which are commitments that will come out, single currency. So, I mean, there's what we get to need to retire, kind of speculating about how horrible it might all look if Scotland is in a different position to the UK on the issue of EU accession, and there are then really for the UK there's kind of issues of reputation, of scale and scope in terms of its foreign policy, and psychologically, the UK then slips to being the fourth largest member state, assuming no Turkish accession.
And the Security Council seat.
Well, these are the kinds of things that one can imagine, start to be raised in all sorts of different causes. I mean, not, but also the defence complication. The UK loses one thing of its territory, it's where its nuclear deterrent force is based, and so on, and so on, and so on. So, I mean, the more you look at it, the more complicated it looks, frankly, to organise a relationship between England and Scotland, even if there is goodwill on both sides. So I think there's sort of in short, there's a lot going on for the UK with the EU and with Scottish independence. Even if neither comes to pass, it's going to be a sort of interesting debate over the next couple of years. On your second point, I mean, if you look at the kind of issues like EEA membership, for example, and just the cost to the UK, and if you calculate it on the basis of what Norway pays, the UK would still, on my reckoning, would still be paying 2/3 of its current net contribution to the EU as a Norway. So how many billions is it worth not to be a member? As well as the the rule-taking kind of position that the UK. And then again, that we can't reasonably expect that publics might latch on these kind of issues as kind of killer arguments for remaining within. But I think positing the alternative and what it would look like if the UK did exit, I would suggest it's quite a powerful tool for those who want to campaign for the UK remaining within the EU. But at the same time, the other member states will have moved on. I mean, they've got their business going. People might be having its referendum debate. But I think there is also this sort of fascinating question for the British collectively as to what they want to do. I mean, we're very uncertain as a nation, and we seem to have sort of compounded uncertainty. We've been through sort of uncertainty about whether we want to be a multicultural state or not, and I think at the moment, I think there is a kind of pause on that rather than it being sort of settled in terms of sort of active political debate. We're uncertain about our relationship with the US. I mean, there's declining enthusiasm to publics, not just because of the Bush administration, but also at the elite level. The realisation that the UK can't afford to keep touch with the US on military technology and so on and so on. So what are the alternatives, and what do they look like for us as a nation and our place in the world? Do we want to be a sort of glorified Singapore of the mainland of Europe, and what does that look and feel like for the UK? And is it a reasonable proposition to create something that feels like that kind of a sort of city-state? I don't know, frankly, and I've searched actually for the sort of plausible alternatives for the UK, and I struggle to find it. But I'd be interested if anybody's come up with a good one that encapsulates what might be a smart position. None of that is an argument for UK-EU accession, and I think to connect to your point about sort of publics and so on, and politicians here and elsewhere have simply done a terrible job of making the case for politics at the European level, and even domestically making the case for politics. I think there's a kind of paradox. They've argued that the European level isn't about politics. It's it's essentially technocratic. But publics realise that it is about politics, and the more they're told it's not, it's technical and so on, the more they want to say, but they haven't got the the mechanisms by which they can affect a say. Hence why you get these sort of break type issues in referendums look seductive, or all kinds of sort of bizarre party politics look attractive. Those who speak the truth, inverted commas, Wilders and others. So.
Yeah, just one very quick side comment, just on your second question. It's one of the big puzzles of the UK's relationship to Europe, that on an official working level, the UK has done very well in terms of agenda setting, has done very well in implementing things, this has worked very smoothly in many ways, more effectively than many other member states, and that has gone on despite all the domestic rhetoric. It has gone on pretty much unnoticed, and nobody. So and that has kind of underpinned the UK's relationship. However, the more things become politicized, this is now spilling over into the kind of the working level. And you've seen that, I mean, you're seeing that in the area of foreign policy now. Anything that has to do with Europe now needs to go up the chain, needs to be approved by ministers, whereas 2 years ago this could have been approved at a lower level. You've seen that in the spat about who's speaking for the EU in the UN context, where the UK was vetoing negotiations, and you may see that in Justice and Home Affairs in the future as well. So this is coming down now, this politicization, and it's going to affect the kind of machinery, which has worked quite smoothly, so regardless of the rhetoric, but it's affecting the machinery now as well.
for the sake of the time, maybe shall we take few
Yeah, sure.
questions together then?
Yeah, it's only a couple of points. I think there are, I mean, I think what's been said so far has been very convincing, very authoritative, and I don't fault it. But I think there are, in the whole EU debate, certain central falsehoods which become built in as almost as premises to the whole discussion. And the first one, I think, that I've noticed is this idea that all member states in the EU are a single, consistent mass. That therefore the UK is against EU members, or EU members of this, or EU members of that, and that it is essentially a falsehood, and it permeates things such as the fiscal pact, where obviously David Cameron on one side made a coup, and on the other side he made something else, but the idea that the EU members are consistent, have a consistent directory as to how the fiscal problems will be worked out, is assuming that all the countries are going to implement consistently and effectively when it comes to it. And already there's a lot of talk in France questioning not only whether the fiscal policy is as it's been sold, but also whether France should take any notice of it. So I think that what has been left out are the internal dynamics in the rest of the EU. And I don't want to go on too long, but I think the other point that was made about emerging nationalism, which obviously is a problem in the UK because of Scottish threats to or desire to separate their ways, even if most Scotsmen actually live in England, and Scots ladies. But there is this fragmentation which is occurring within many other European states, and to some extent, I would say that it is a result of the imperial structure of the EU. As the EU becomes a greater entity and more centralised, fragmentation is more likely to occur, and that's just a possibility. But it is happening in Italy, and has been for many decades. The north-south split makes economic life in a sense very difficult. It's happening in Spain, and may happen in Spain before it happens in England, because Catalonia is deeply anti-nationalist, also anti-Spanish, and so I think that these elements need to be built into the argument as a whole, because they tend to then descend to the point of well, if the UK left the EU, then we'd lose all our international trade, and we wouldn't be able to trade with the EU countries, which is obviously nonsense. Is Mercedes going to stop selling us cars? Anyway, that's my
Thank you, Fabian.
Yeah, only to add something, I think that we didn't touch upon the national security and the impact that will have on the UK national security. For instance, let's say UK has a very strong impact on some of the key institutions in Europe in fighting organized crime, like Europol. For instance, the head of Europol now is English, and as they admit, one of the countries that benefits from the database of Europol, the main country is UK. On the other hand, we have Eurojust, as the crime is going global and transborder. It is very difficult to deal with cybercrime. For instance, there was a case on pedophilia where out of thousands of members, 72 were in Netherlands, and some in England, and some in France. And this was a big problem in terms of cooperation, and Eurojust tried to cope and deal and be very beneficial. So, in a sense, I think where we talk a lot on the financial or economic aspect, we forget the criminal aspect, and especially in financial crime, organized crime, UK now has been one of the most fragmented places on investing process of crime. And I think this will be it will have a huge impact on the EU if they UK
Right,
will leave
maybe
EU.
we'll-
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Like, we can take your question
yeah.
as well.
I think it was you, Richard, that you mentioned intellectualising of the alternatives for the UK's place in the world. I think you mentioned that ideas were sort of, rather than reaching back into the past, they were heading forward into a sort of new possibilities. I did a piece of work last year about Britain's relationship with Europe and particularly the euro. And one of my arguments was, Britain and Europe being this awkward partner with Europe, was that Britain's imperial history had something to do with it. And I sort of said it was something to do with, maybe it was in the subconscious of the nation. It's about this old imperial power that we once had. I was just wondering what your views on that sort of are.
Shall we maybe first, if you want to respond these 3 questions?
Maybe not to all of them already. Just very briefly on the issue of sort of Britain's history. Yes, it clearly matters, but the history is not a lived history in the sense it's a constant sort of reinterpreted history. So there's a kind of some curious almost circularity about where Britain finds itself in the world. My father, because he was in the military, was based all over the world. Because Britain had military bases all over the world. If I had been in the military, the places that I would have served would have been rather narrow. In fact, I would have spent my time in Northern Ireland, in Germany, and possibly the Falkland Islands if I was very unlucky. Even if you look at a narrow area, like the sort of experience of those who have a military career, who've had an experience, a very narrow area of British life. First of all, the number of people who have that kind of career is narrow. But the kind of experience that people have had just after the Second World War is that it's not unusual to work somewhere within the Commonwealth or to have relatives who had moved out to the white and black Commonwealth in the past. They moved into tracing their family history, which many British people are. They went to Canada, they went to South Africa, they went to Australia, and are still there. And so isn't that difficult to kind of tap into that idea that the UK has always been more than Europe, and Europe sort of narrows our horizons, and you see that articulated by Churchill after the Second World War, and the idea of 3 circles, and the speaking world empire, as well as being Europe, but not of Europe. But I think the interesting thing about the way there's this new positivism is it isn't looking back in that way. It's reinventing the idea of the Commonwealth. And it's the Commonwealth is for New Labour they tried to sort of get it funkier, but the Tories have actually got quite a nice idea now about the networking, which is through English language, through the legal heritage. It isn't about shed the kind of colonialism, and you instrumentalise it much more. And I think that's the curious thing. And if you talk to, certainly if you talk to my students, English national students find the EU terribly boring because they actually don't want to do Erasmus in the EU. They want to go to Beijing, or they want to go to Brasilia. There's this idea that that you've got to kind of go global rather than just go regional. So we've got on the one hand this kind of relationship, complicated relationship with different bits of the world because of colonialism. It's there in a kind of residual sense of Britain sort of being more than just a kind of an island just off the European mainland. But it's been invented in ways in which couldn't have been imagined by my parents or my grandparents, who had a different kind of lived relationship with the world outside, which was things like imperial preference and what they consumed was because real preferential terms of aid. If you look now at what we do, I mean, basically British kids, British adults, we're European in terms of what we consume, how we consume, what our aspirations are. And you've just got to look at the way in which large TNCs organise their business. There's a European division, there's a UK division, and that kind of informal integration, which political scientists and other social scientists find very difficult to measure and do it in a fairly patchy way. Suggest that we've got embeddedness within Europe. We also have this extra European identity that we're all working through. And by the way, we've got some national stuff now going on. And we can't quite work out a hierarchy of how they fit. And just in my partnership, which is why I think this kind of accounts that I'm on the one hand European, I'm this, that, and the other. Actually, don't necessarily fit. Actually, so people don't hold those together in that kind of simplistic way. They're much more kind of kaleidoscopic, basically shift identities and relationships, shift and so on for a whole set of different reasons. And the politics of that coalition, I mean, I really, it's one of the things I would give the coalition a lot of credit for. I mean, I think they've really set out a sort of vision of Britain's place in the world, which is plausible. Whether it's sustainable is another matter, but I think it is plausible, and I think that's a shift from where Britain was a decade or so ago. That wasn't so obvious. The choices weren't so obvious. It was the sort of looking out to the Atlantic or looking to Europe. That's gone.
Christoph, if you want to respond to the
Yeah, I have two quick points to make. I mean, one is actually going back to what you've initially said about the faults of homogenizing the rest of Europe and how different they were from the UK. Well, clearly the UK, I mean, part of the tragedy of the UK is that it will have some natural allies in a number of policy areas and has a lot to contribute. I mean, the criticism of understanding financial markets and how they work, having a global outlook in foreign policy. There are a lot of things that the UK can contribute, and where it has allies on policy substance with other European partners. And Euroscepticism itself is not a purely British phenomenon. There are concerns, questions about Europe. However, the way it conducts itself with its European partners means it is not listened to. It is seen as acting in bad faith. All the criticism of monetary union at the time, or even criticism in Eurosceptic papers, some of them of European corruption. There is European corruption, there's fraud on the but if you are seen as being motivated primarily by Euroscepticism, nobody will listen to you. And that is the problem of Britain, that it is applying mirror imaging to the other partners and thinks the other partners are just acting on particular rational policies on Europe. And then is surprised that if it uses certain rhetoric, it will get a counter-reaction and will not get its alliances that it thinks it will. This is the big, for me, one of the big tragedies that Britain would be welcomed in many ways, and Britain's contribution is positive, and that Britain has an interest in making positive contribution, but because it is seeing Europe as a purely instrumental arena to extract as much possible out of it without buying into any of the political ideas that underpin the project, it's punching below its weight and is now it's leaking political capital on a massive scale, and I think that's where you get then a homogeneous European reaction against Britain, not because there's a disagreement on particular policies, but because there's a disagreement with the way it conducts itself, with the way it engages with its European partners, with the way it wields its veto, with the way it plays to domestic audiences, because it assumes that there are no domestic concerns in other member states as well. Of course there are, but there are some ground rules you have to play by if you want to be taken seriously, and unfortunately, Britain has left that realm. I think that's the problem. You want to come in on that?
No, I was just going to say, I mean, one of the things I think is worth looking at, for those who are looking for something to study at, is the sort of the quality of British diplomacy. And you can see that, I mean, the Maastricht Treaty, I think, actually was a sort of diplomatic masterclass, in securing opt-outs, which persons the opportunity to opt in. And the ones choosing, I mean, that was superb. I mean, I think that's for me, an all-time kind of British diplomatic, sort of post-Second World War diplomatic hire. I mean, I think it was absolutely superb. But the curious thing about the coalition government with things like the EU bill, for example, is to say, oh, we're actually going to take away our sort of negotiating capital before we even come to the table, and we're saying with the budget debates. It's as if everything that Britain's learned about diplomacy and European diplomacy over the last 200 years, it's just been sort of trashed. And we're in this kind of naivist school, in the Neanderthalic school of diplomacy, apparently, which is, as a Briton, I don't understand. I mean, it's not a good way to go. In any sphere of life, it's not a good way about going about negotiation, especially by us of very intelligent individuals, frankly. So there's certainly some kind of collective cognitive dissonance on the part of these people that I don't understand.
Right. Our time is over. I don't know if our speakers have more time. Maybe there's more tea and coffee as well. We can conclude the discussion here. But if you wanted to stay over a little longer and ask more questions, I'm aware that everyone has questions in mind. But sorry, the time is over. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you very much to our speakers. And please join me in thanking both of our speakers for today's